So this is the first time I've ever given a talk in a movie theater before, so this is an interesting experience. I wanted to talk about making economics more inclusive and to talk about keeping up with the student body. So the first thing to know is that women are dominating education. And I'm sure many of you already know that, but sometimes we forget how true that is. So if you look at a woman, or I think it's still okay to call them boys and girls when there are seniors in high school, graduating from seniors in high school, nearly 3/4 of the girls graduating from high school will go on in the very next year to some form of college education, to a 2-year program or a 4-year program. And that's about 10 percentage points more than their male classmates. So they're going to college more, they're graduating from college more, they're going on to graduate school more. So there are, in the most recent year, 135 female graduate students for every 100 graduate students. So they're going to graduate school and they're completing degrees. So 52% of the PhDs, the doctoral degrees, were awarded to women in the most recent year. So what does this mean? Well, this means, obviously, that as we start to look at our labor force, a growing share of the educated part of our labor force is comprised of women. So women, if you were looking at workers, women hold 49% of the jobs today. And they are increasingly representing the majority of the college-educated workforce. And here what you see are 25 to 34-year-olds. And you can see that not that long ago, it was a much larger share of men with BA degrees and men with graduate degrees. And today, among the workers, it's a larger share of women with graduate degrees in this age group and women with undergraduate degrees. So women are going to school more. They're entering the workforce with more education. But here's the problem. They're not majoring in economics at the same rates. So what about the other sciences? So people often say, well, economics, all the sciences are struggling. So let's put this in perspective. Here we see, and this is from the American Community Survey, which asked people about their major, biology went from being 30% female, and this is by year of birth, so that would have been about the class of 67. It's a birth cohort of 1945, I should have said that, to about 62% by the time we're dealing with classes graduating in the 2000s. If you look at math, it's also grown, and it's still not representative of the student body, but it's above economics. What you see about economics is, yes, there was growth in economics, and that growth really occurred sharply for the birth cohorts between 1945 and 1960, but it's really stalled since then. So what does that mean? That means that we were adding more women into economics programs in the 1960s and the 1970s, but we really stopped about 30 years ago. And here you can see this a little bit better, that the share peaked at about 35% in 1960, again, the class of 1960, so in the 1980s, and that's really where it has stayed. This idea that we're not increasing the ranks of women in economics is true when we look beyond undergraduate majors. You can see it at every level, and this is a graph produced by CSWEP showing over the last 20 years, since 1997, the gender share of full professors, first-year PhD students, new PhDs, assistant professors, and the mysterious Series 3 as associate professors. And what you see, again, is just not much of an increase. A little bit of an increase in new PhDs in the early 2000s, but a lot of flatlining. Now, it turns out this is going on to an even greater extent when we start looking at racial minorities and ethnic minorities. Among bachelor's candidates, there has been enormous growth in the last 10 to 20 years in Hispanics and blacks going on to get BAs. And this graph is from the Committee on the Status of Minorities in Economics. But you can see that there's been no increase in the share of black econ undergrads. And in fact, it's below where it was in 2009. There's been a little bit more of an increase among Hispanic economics bachelor's undergraduate econ majors, but that it pales in comparison to the overall rise in BAs. So again, to put this in perspective, about over 9% of all undergraduates are black, and around 4% of undergraduate econ majors are black. So we've got really big differences in what the shares are in econ compared to other fields. And then, again, we can take this up the line and look at PhD students, and we see big differences there by racial categories as well. We haven't seen much of an increase at all, no increase at all in black or Hispanic economics PhD students, despite the fact that they've been rising in other fields. So why is this a problem, this lack of diversity in our field? So I would argue, first of all, it stifles the field. It makes it hard for us to grow. It makes us irrelevant to large numbers of people. And it allows it to become more insular and hard for outsiders to understand. So economics can and should be more inclusive. And I'm going to show you some data where students complain about the math in economics. And you're going to say, yep, that's what we always think. It's the math in economics that makes it harder for us to be inclusive. But I'm going to argue that it's not the math. Even though students are telling us the math, when you look at the other majors that have math, they're making more progress than we are. So there's more we can do. And it's not about making economics less math-based. It's making economics more relevant to real people's lives and to real decision-making. And it turns out that making it more relevant, making it more useful for people, will help us make it more inclusive. But not only will it help us make it more inclusive, but I think it would makes us more relevant. So here are some recent heads of the National Economic Council working for the President of the United States. Now, the President does have another economist who advises him or her, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. But the National Economic Council, which runs a lot of the economic policy for the President of the United States, is typically headed by somebody who calls him or herself an economist and has no training in economics. So recent heads majored in math, science, political science. I would argue that if we make economics more inclusive for minorities, for women, we're also going to help these kind of white men who want to go on and do economics in the world, study economics before they go and do it. So I think that being more relevant is actually useful for all our students. So this isn't about favoring one set of students over another set of students. It's about making the field more attractive to a wider body of students. Okay, so I'm really fortunate that we've just been gathering some data at the University of Michigan. In fact, we did a survey of the student body that was done by two of our PhD students with oversight from Martha Bailey, who's also very interested in gender issues, and Justin Wolfers, who's actually teaching Econ 101, helped get all his students to take this, but it was administered to all the students in Econ 101, and we have a lot of students that take Econ 101. And we matched it with some administrative data, and this survey just closed on Friday, so these are really preliminary results, and I hope our graduate students continue to work in this area. But one of the things that you'll see from the administrative data, these are 101 courses. Economics, intro courses, biology, chemistry, engineering, math, and physics. So this is who's enrolled. And what you'll see is that economics at the University of Michigan is, unfortunately, like economics at a lot of schools. It hasn't made a lot of progress. our 101 student share is around 40% women. And that's despite the fact that, just like every other school, the majority of our students are women. Now, what about our share of students in biology? Well, there you can see the share of students taking intro biology is 65%. One of the things you have to keep in mind is I talk to a lot of people who think, well, we're getting to gender parity in economics because we're 50-50. But when your school is 60-40, you're not at gender parity when you're at 50-50. But the thing that's been just most miraculous, I think, at the University of Michigan is the physics department decided that they were really frustrated with 25% of enrollment in Physics 101 being women in 2006. And in 10 years, they moved their share from a quarter to 45%. So this is something we can do quickly, and there are small changes that will help us do it. Engineering hasn't quite caught up to economics, but it's actually made a lot more progress. So in the last 5 years, has been able to move its share from a quarter to almost 35%. But one thing to notice is that engineering is the only 101 course that has a smaller share female than the other 101 courses. So math, physics, chemistry, biology are all getting more women in the classroom than economics is. So what we can learn from this is that change can happen quickly when we put our minds to it, and that gender differences in math is not the primary determinant. Okay, so here is the ratio of female to male students' major preferences. So this is of the 101 students we surveyed, what do they want to major in? Most of them haven't declared a major, so this is what they intend to major in. And what you see is this is women per men in each field. And in economics, it's about half a woman for every man, or 1 woman for every 2 men. That's about the same as the STEM fields. Business is doing a little bit better. It's almost near parity 1 for 1. Where are the women going? They are disproportionately going to the humanities, but where they're really going is the other social sciences. They're going to the social sciences that they think are more relevant for the types of things they're interested in and the types of things they care about. So what is it that women say makes them study economics? So women, their motivation for majoring in economics, these are the ones who tell us they're going to major in economics. The women are more likely to say they're doing it because of interest. And that's true for anything they're choosing. They're following their interests. The men are following the money. So the men are much more likely to tell us they're choosing this major because of the fact that it's where they see the employment opportunities coming from. And the women are more affected by their experience in the class. So I have enjoyed the classes and or the prerequisites for this major. And I wasn't able to get, we're doing the survey was done with a racial background, with a racial breakdown as well, but as you probably know, that's like a little bit more complicated trying to figure out what categories to put people in. But I was working with the data last night, and it also looks like we see something pretty similar when we're looking at racial minorities, African Americans in particular, that their experience in the class has a big impact on whether they choose to major in it compared to other people. So they're more likely to say that they're going to major because they've enjoyed the class so far, or they're thinking about majoring in it because of their experience in the class. They're more sensitive to that. Again, similarly, more driven by interest, by their experience. And then there is a lot of grade fear. So women would say they would major in economics if the classes were more interesting. The economics major was less math intensive, my grades in economics were higher than in other classes, and the economics major was less challenging. So those are like the primary things where we see big gender differences. And what are women telling us? I'm worried about my grades. I think that math might be having a negative impact on my grade, and I want something to be interesting. Now, what's a little bit hard in interpreting these data is that 20% of women won't consider majoring in economics, and that was one of the choice buckets. And so all of these categories are a little bit biased by the fact that women about 20% said they would not consider majoring in economics under any circumstances. And that was a little bit over, somewhere between 10 and 15% for men. So women are more likely to say, just not going to do it. And that's the same thing we see with racial minorities. A quarter of non-white students, when they're asked, what would make you major in economics, choose the box, nothing would make me major in economics. Among those that choose an answer, you see that interesting matters more and there's not this sort of grade gap. If anything, it's Caucasians who are telling us they'd be more likely to choose economics if the major was less challenging. Okay, so I skipped over something I want to come back to. We also, Worth did a survey of principals and instructors a few years ago, and they asked instructors, what do you think is affecting gender differences in the classroom? And most respondents, both male and female, or men and women who teach first-year economics, think that men and women learn differently. So both, you can see that, there's not everybody agrees, but there's not like a real gender difference in terms of the instructor in how much you agree that men and women learn differently. And I think that the students would agree with this a little bit as well. So, both, and here's what the professors, instructors argue, is that female students learn a bit better by example. They don't learn very well mathematically. In fact, 0% of people said women learn better mathematically. They don't learn as well graphically, and they learn better verbally. So this is, again, what instructors' interpretation. But I think if we put aside the gender differences and step back for a minute and look at those responses, we're told something that's really important, which is that our students learn better through example, regardless of gender. So 60% of instructors believe that it's the examples that speak to students. So then, if it's the examples that speak to students, what should we be doing differently? Well, we know some things about the type of examples that students like and that resonate with them. They want real-world examples. They prefer things that feel real to them than things that feel made up. We can also do examples that feel useful to them or connected to their lives in some way. That doesn't mean that every example is about college pizza. It means that it's about the kinds of decisions they might make. For instance, when they graduate, many of them are going to have to decide, or even as students who are commuting in many schools, they have to decide, should they buy a car or should they rely on Uber? That's exactly the kind of calculation economics is designed to help them try to figure out. And doing examples that feel like these are problems I'm solving on a regular basis, in my own life, here's how the tools of economics can help me approach that better, is going to do a better job of connecting to students. We need to explore a wider variety of industries. So, of course, we're going to teach about trade. But the truth is our economy is 75% non-tradable goods. So when we're giving examples, we can't just focus on the tradable goods sector of our economy. We need to think a lot about services, because that's what our students are learning about, and that's what they're going to engage with. That's what they're going to be doing. So we should be thinking about education, retail, restaurants, tourism, the types of things that our students are going to do. We want to focus on examples that are going to resonate more with both genders, and explore good decision-making in their own lives as consumers, as workers, as savers. Math is easy for us to test, but it's also really easy for the students to forget. And if we want to connect with our students, it's the concepts we have to make sure that they are engaging with and understanding and memorizing and learning how the math helps them get a better understanding of those concepts rather than memorizing the math to solve the problem. So there's, if you were to go on the web and start looking for information about how to teach in a more inclusive fashion, you'll see that there are a lot of STEM fields dedicated towards trying to teach undergrads in a more inclusive fashion. And they have checklists for professors. They have questions for you to ask yourself about things about the examples, about who's raising their hand, how you're calling on people. And here I pulled the UK's Institute of Physics, which has in it many documents on how to teach physics in a more inclusive way. And here's some some of their recommendations. Use everyday language when you can instead of technical jargon. Call on students at random instead of asking for volunteers, since we all know that men are going to be more likely to volunteer and can easily dominate a discussion. Use examples that relate to students' everyday experiences. We already talked about that. Avoid male and female stereotypes in class. This may sound really obvious. Don't pigeonhole men and women into stereotypical positions. But it's really hard when you're teaching to not fall into that trap. But yet it's actually really important that you don't. And then keep track of the number of male and female students that you've called on. Here, I'm going to add something else, which is expect more from your textbooks. Because what's happening is our textbooks are setting the stage for who should be an economist by talking about men and women engaged in economics every day. And I went through a bunch of principles textbooks. You can see a bunch of them here. With not picking on anybody in particular, and counted up, obviously electronically, the number of he's and she's that appeared in the book. And what you can see is that he's dominates textbooks. She's are too absent from the textbooks. The characters in the textbooks disproportionately are male. When they're female, often they're forced or feel forced. And, or worse, they have women engaged in stereotypical female things because they're a particular effort to reach women. You can see that this dominance is pretty high, right? So for it to pick on Case, Fair, and Oster, there I found there was twice as many examples with men as there were with women. So the problem is, this is the kind of subtle thing that we don't think about. I don't think anybody was doing this purposely. And the problem is that I bet no one's ever thought, when I finished writing my textbook, maybe I should do a count and figure out whether or not I had bias. But it turns out we're all fallible to implicit biases and to stereotypes, even when we're trying really hard not to do that. And that's how we can end up in these kinds of situations. So one of the biggest things we're going to have to do to teach economics in a more inclusive way is figure out how to counteract our implicit biases. The problem with implicit bias, and the reason it's become such a focus in the STEM fields in terms of combating implicit bias, is because it's implicit. Nobody's doing anything mean. We're not purposely trying to make the room more welcoming to one group of students over another group of students. It's that we have our own way of seeing the world that's been shaped by our experiences. And I started by showing you that our experiences in economics are largely male. They're largely white. And as a result, there's implicit biases that creep in that perpetuate that situation where economics continues to be largely white, largely male. So we rely on stereotypes more heavily when there are more unknowns in a situation. Being aware of implicit biases is the first step. And professors are actually in a really good position to be aware of their students' implicit biases and to try to counter them. So positive reinforcements can help break stereotypes and equalize learning in the classroom. I want to give you an example because I said we need to make examples more real life. We need to make examples more relatable to students. So I picked an example that's pretty relatable to students, but at the same time is a type of example that's more welcoming to one particular group of students. So here we have an example which is about elasticity, and they talk about football games. So when we're trying to relate to our students, we often resort to sports, and yet sports ends up making economics less inviting to women. So here is an example where how many more fans would come to a football game if the price were lowered, and here we can think about revenue. Here's a different example, and this example is more appealing to women. It's also real life. So here we had, in 2015, there was a giant maelstrom over Taylor Swift pulling her music from Spotify. But this was a giant fight over elasticities. And it turns out it's a great way to be able to teach elasticity to students and help them understand how their tools of economics can help them understand what's going on in the real world around them a little bit better. And this is the type of example that not only meets the criteria of being real world, but it's one that your students are more likely to have already thought about, debated, discussed. And then what you're doing is showing them that I'm going to give you a set of tools. It's going to give you a different perspective on that and a different way to think about it. So this sort of brings me to where I want to wrap up, which is what are the things that might be driving women away from economics? We need to make sure that we show that economics leads to fulfilling careers in many areas. And we need to be cognizant of disparities in how women see their performance with grades. So let me give you a couple points on that. One is these are the 20 major occupations of economists. So number 16 is economist. What's the number one occupation of an econ major? A manager and administrator. The number two is a lawyer. Right? So most of your students who major in economics don't grow up to become economists. They grow up to do a bunch of other things. And the thing is, I'm going to stop here and just emphasize, the students, econ is not a field that has problems, with demand in the sense that, we're not the classics department. But if we're not teaching in an inclusive way and we start losing access to the students who are coming to school, these fields are still going to have people coming into them, and there's going to be fewer people going into those fields with econ degrees. So what industry do they work in? Mostly in professional services, a big group in finance, but there's also a lot in manufacturing and in retail. So you're as likely to be in retail trade as manufacturing. Now ask yourself, are the examples you teach as likely to be in retail trade as in some sort of manufactured goods situation? What about the top occupations of female economics graduates? Women become accountants. So you can see they also become management analysts and post-secondary teachers. So our econ students are going into various occupations But it's not about making them economists. It's about making them better at their job. And their job is going to be all of these different things. So finally, the last thing I wanted to say before was women are more sensitive to what grade they get. Women are less likely to go on if they get a lower grade than men. So, there's a lot that schools and courses have to think about when they're trying to think about their curve and grade inflation. And so I'm not going to give anybody any advice on that. But one of the things we do have to do is reach out a little bit harder to those women in our classes that, could actually be a really good econ student, but maybe didn't get an A in the class. And they're really reluctant, and they're going to need that extra encouragement if they're going to go on to a second class. More so than our male students who tend to externalize a little bit more than female students do when they don't quite get the grade they want. And so they don't need quite as much of the build back up if they haven't succeeded. So to conclude, economics needs to do more to educate and attract a diverse group of students. We can do more. We have to think both about implicit and explicit forms of discrimination. And we need to think about this as a problem that we want to solve for the sake of our own field in order to be more relevant and to ensure that people going into the world have the useful tools that economics has developed that will allow them to be better decision makers across the many, many different occupations they'll likely go into.